Değerli katılımcılar, bir kez daha
Distinguished participants, we're together once again. Our session is going to be the Reloop environment platform. Well, the session started a bit earlier, so Clarissa is going to be the next speaker. Anna and Clarissa changed places. Reloop is based in Belgium, in the heart of Europe, follows the agenda in Europe, and has got essay in environmental matters. And in terms of circular economy, it is a very reputable platform. We have a partnership with them, and we try to make use of their experience. And we do follow the current developments in the EU through this platform. There was a very important meeting held last week. Clarissa is going to give you information about that. The EU is focusing on circular economy and attaches significant importance to the DRS system. For this reason, this is going to be a big advantage for all of us in the work that we do with our European counterparts.
Bu tip etkinlikleri yapmaya da devam edeceğiz.
We are very pleased with such activities, and we will continue in this way. Anna Larsson is the next speaker. Anna is the Reloop Europe director. She's going to give us information about a deposit for beverage containers. Each and every country has its own legislation, and she's going to give us information about the legislations in those countries, and she's going to also give us information about the lessons learned. The floor is yours, Anna. You can start.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation, Aynur. I hope you can see my screen and you can hear me well. If there are any challenges, please let me know. Today, I would like to talk about the deposit system from the perspective of the legislation. I have prepared for you the presentation that will focus on the common denominators of the provisions related to the deposit systems in Europe. And I will also give you some examples on how the deposit legislation evolved based on the experiences that the countries gathered during the years. So let us start with the key provisions. There are 9 of them, and this is a field of application. This is scope, meaning both in terms of the materials that are covered by the system, but also product types. Definitions are important. Anything related to the administration, obligations of the parties. It is extremely important because the deposit system is a national one and very complex. So the provisions related to the obligations of the parties, normally producers who put to market and retailers who would collect, will have to be very clearly defined. Utmost important is a marking related to the deposit system barcode and also symbol. Targets, meaning the collection rates that have to be achieved in the deposit scheme. Deadlines. Some provisions would come in force earlier because the system operator, for example, has to be established, but some will follow. And the final, of course, most important date is the implementation date. And the last but not least, the penalties in the system. So I will not focus on this slide. We will discuss the provisions and the key provisions separately, slide by slide. But before jumping into that, I would like to talk a little bit about primary and secondary legislation, because some provisions related to the deposit system are required to be part of the so-called primary acts to secure that they would be implemented in a proper way. But there are some issues that might be subject to change during the years, like, for example, the minimum value of the deposit. And that kind of regulation could be subject to the secondary legislation. As we see the example from Slovakia here on the slide, the minimum deposit amount for a disposable beverage container is set as follows: 12 euro cents for that is PET bottle, and 10 euro cents for metal container. And this is subject to the decree, which is lower in the rank compared to the act of law. This was the example from Slovakia. Also here, I would like to mention, I will talk about that later as well, that there are some issues related to the fiscal acts in the deposit system, and a good example is VAT. So it's also very recommended to set a VAT-free deposit already at the level of the primary legislation, because VAT is normally regulated in the fiscal acts, and you cannot change the fiscal act regulation by the lower rank regulation, like decree. So let's go to next territory. Of course, it is very important to specify that the deposit system applies to the containers in the certain geographical area. Here you can see the example from Slovakia. This act, it is Act on a Deposit for Single Use, applies to disposable beverage containers placed on the market in the Slovak Republic. Very important provision is related to the scope of the deposit system, of the materials covered and of the products covered. And here I would like to give you example from Estonian legislation. This is Act on Packaging and Packaging Waste. And here we can read that the deposit is established for the following non-reusable packaging of beer, alcoholic beverages with low ethanol content, cider, perry, and soft drinks, in glass, in plastic, and in metal. So here you can clearly see what is the product scope and what is the material scope of the deposit system. I would like to pay your attention also to yet another section here in this article related to the reusable beverage packaging. Here we can read that the deposit is established for following reusable packaging. You see the product scope in glass and plastic. So in the same legislation, we see that the two fractions, one-way packages and refillable packages, are covered. With regards to the scope for material and products, it's very important to also define what products are not subject to deposit. And there will be some of them, for example, and that is again the legislation from Estonia, the packages that is being exported. So if a producer in Turkey produces water or drink or any beverage, beer, and exports that, of course it would not be subject to Turkish deposit. And any products sold on vessels and airplanes, of course, are not subject to deposit either. Also, there is a limitation with regards to the size of the packaging. And here we can see that any packaging that is between 0.1 liter and 3 liter is covered by the deposit system. Anything below and above is not. Let's move to the obligations. I mentioned to you that it is extremely important to give clear guidelines with regards to the deposit system, because it is a framework that is national, and every stakeholder that is related to the deposit system. Excuse me, are there any difficulties? No, okay, I will continue. Every obligation has to be clearly defined. I can hear echo. Is it better now? Yeah, no, still some echo. I will continue. And basically, all the provisions have to depict the flow of the deposit, flow of the materials in the system, which you can see on the right hand side. And I also know that you have been watching a film which depicts these processes in the deposit system, and all of them have to be also reflected in the legislation. For example, that producer initiates a deposit and pays that to the system operator. That distributor pays the deposit to the producer. That retailer pays the deposit to the distributor. Then again, about provisions related to the take-back obligation for the retailers. Anything related to control of some institutions, public institutions that are related. It could be health authority, it could be environmental monitoring services, and so on. Here I would like to present an example from Slovakia with regards to the obligations of producers of the packaging, because they are subject to the regulations. They are the entities that put to market the packages that are covered by the deposit scheme. So their obligation is, as we mentioned, to apply a deposit, to clearly mark their packaging according to the guidelines related to the deposit framework. They need to keep a separate accounting records for the packages put to market. They need to enter a contract with the system operator. They also need to register with the system operator. Of course, they are obliged, and this is clearly defined in the legislation, to pay the EPR fee, extended producer responsibility fee, to the system operator, who acts as the producer responsibility organization. They are obliged to cover all the administrators, system operators' costs. And again, they have to be ready to present some documentation for if control is required. Now we are coming to a very important obligation related to another stakeholder of the system, and this is retail sector. Clarissa will speak more about that. Standard European deposit system, it is retailers that have the obligation to take back the deposit-bearing containers. And here we see example from the Act of Packaging and Packaging Waste from Lithuania. And we can read that sellers of single-use packaging shall accept waste of single-use packaging subject to deposit in accordance with paragraph 2 and refund the deposit. And then let's stop here. So clearly we have the defined obligation for the retailers to collect, to receive, and also to give the deposit value back to the consumers, because we know that consumers would have paid a deposit value upon purchase of a product subject to the deposit. Now we can read later in the section of this article that there is an exception. This is in Lithuania, except for the sellers of packaging trading in shops with commercial area not exceeding 300 square meters. That is excluding rural shops. Here I would like to mention that Lithuania does not necessarily have to be the model for other countries. The exception for the retailers has to be established based on very thorough analysis of the market situation. And I would like to give example of Scotland or Romania, also in Norway. All the retailers and are obliged to take back. Why? Because in Scotland, in Romania, the volume sold in the modern trade, as we see in Lithuania, this 300 square meter represent modern trade, is only about 50%, and still there is a lot of volume, a lot of products sold in so-called traditional retail sector. So in this situation, you cannot exclude the shops and retailers smaller than 300 or 200 square meters. You have to put the obligation on all of them. So this possible exception, yet again, will depend on the market situation. And you will see in the legislation from Scotland and also Romanian example that all the selling points are obliged to take back. Then we come here to the topic of the exceptions of the take back. This is based on the experience in Estonia. Rural shops were obliged to take back, and suddenly there appeared a problem with the big transport. Someone could have come with many packages, and of course this person had right to demand that this little shop would pay the deposit back. And of course, later on, the change in the law had to be implemented to avoid these situations. And now we can read in the legislation from Finland, but it's also similar in Estonia, that the retailer must accept empty beverage containers belonging to the same return system in a quantity deemed reasonable as regards the quantity of packaged beverage for sale. And this provision is much more detailed in the proposal in Romania. I will also make that available to you, where it says that only the amount of the daily sales can be subject to taking back. As I mentioned, that is to avoid the situations that if all the shops are included and they have the take back obligation, of course, some of them will be too small to accept 1,000 packages per day. So this is based on experience. I would like to talk a little bit about return to retail, some other detailed provisions, and you can see based on pictures that the collection points, like this one, if you see my pointer, it's the container located outside the supermarket, or a collection point in the parking lot, or this outdoor collection point, are not in the building of the retail location. So sometimes it is also necessary to include provision regulating the distance between the shop and the collection infrastructure that has to be located. So return to retail does not necessarily mean that collection point is inside the shop. It can be outside, but then the legislation should also provide for the guidance how many meters, and this is usually 150 meters within the radius of the shop. And these pictures are to depict two main types of the collection. So on the left-hand side, you see the automated collection point. And on the right-hand side, this is a picture from Norway. You can see the exemplification of how the packages are collected in manual, so-called manual location, like at this petrol station in in Norway. Seller here scans the bottle, gives the money back to the customer, and then the packages are collected in the plastic bags in the storage area and collected from this selling point on regular basis by the transport appointed by the system operator. We have talked in the beginning about provisions related to the collection levels. These are very important, and here I would like to comment that it is not right to introduce a deposit system and link the collection rates for low levels. This is the deposit system is a very powerful mechanism based on the monetary incentive, and you can always expect much higher than normal collection rates. Therefore, you would not see, like in European Union, for the let's say for the plastic or metal packaging, the level of 50%. That would not have sense. You have to expect high collection rates, and you have to demand in the deposit system high collection targets. And here I would like to give you example from Scotland. The legislation was fully adopted last year in May. So of course, the legislator has to take into consideration that the collection rate will grow gradually. It will not achieve 90% in the first year. So he gives allowance for the step-by-step development, and demands the collection rate at the level of 70 in the first year, 80 in the second year, and 90 in the third year and consecutive years. This is very important, and related to these collection rates are the penalties for not attaining these goals. Minimum deposit value. It is extremely important that the legislator regulates the deposit value. And deposit value, as we know, has to be calculated based on the socio-economic conditions in the country. It is very individual. In Nordic countries, it is higher, around 20 euro cents. In Germany, we have 25 euro cents. In East European countries, the recommended level is around 10 euro cents. Every country will have a different deposit value based on the conditions, based on the economic development. And that deposit value, as we mentioned in the beginning, will change through the time. So it's important that it is a decision of the Ministry of Environment to decide upon the level of the deposit value. Here we can see some regulations regarding the deposit marking, deposit system related marking. There will be a symbol of the deposit elaborated by the system operator. This symbol will be visible and recognizable by the customers. It is a graphic symbol of the deposit framework, and every time the consumer buys the product, he would recognize that the packages related to this product are subject to deposit. He will pay the deposit value, and later on, with this symbol, he will know that this is the package that he has to bring back to the shop. But for the system operator, the very most important identifier is a barcode, because based on the barcode, as we can see on the right side of this slide, the producers report the amount that is put to market. And based on this amount, they pay deposit value as well as EPR fee, the producer's fee to cover the system cost. Here we can see how it was highlighted in the Slovak legislation. Disposable beverage containers subject to a deposit must be marked with a distinctive barcode identifier, text, and graphics. A very important stakeholder in the system, deposit system, will be system operator, and of course that requires some detailed provisions in the deposit system legislation. Here we see the example from Slovakia, where it clearly says that the administrator is a non-profit organization, and the task of this entity is to coordinate activities related to the system, finance the system, and proceed with the educational and promotional activities. You will also see the example of the provisions related to the system operator in the Scottish example. There is a whole chapter with subchapters related to this entity. Offenses and penalties, as I mentioned, they have to be part of the system to secure that the law related to the deposit is not thiefless, that all the market actors apply to this legislation, that all producers, distributors, and retailers apply, for example, a deposit value on top of the price, that producers and the system operator secures the attainment of the collection targets. Basically, that there is no fraud and cheating in the system, no free riding, etc. The objective of the penalty, as it was phrased by the official from the Slovak Republic, is to secure that the system is well functioning, and they set the level of the penalty, for example, for non-attaining the target at 4,000 euro per ton. And they also mentioned that the decisions related to the penalties should not be arbitrary. In many countries, we can see the example where a bureaucrat can apply a penalty ranging between some minimum and maximum level, and as phrased and communicated by the government representative from Slovakia, in deposit system, it would be recommended to have the targeted and well-defined penalties that are not subject to arbitrary decisions. I also mentioned at the beginning that the legislation should clearly define the different moments of entering into force. So the final provision regarding the date will be the date of the implementation, which will be the last phase in the implementation of the deposit system after choosing the system operator, after all the producers are linked to the system, and everyone is ready to put to market deposit-bearing containers. In every country, there will be group of institutions that will monitor and control the deposit system. It might be like in Slovakia, Environment Ministry. There are also different inspectorates. It will be different in individual per country depending on the type of the institutions that are that have some responsibilities. I mentioned health security inspectorate. It could be environment inspectorate. Also, some trade inspection related authorities can be engaged in the system. About VAT in the deposit, we have already that issue we mentioned in the beginning. It's very important to regulate that at the primary legislation level. And now I would like to talk about the situation when the deposit system, you will hear later on today about the system like in Finland, where the deposit is not obligatory. The producer can either join the deposit system or pay €0.5 for every liter that is put to market from the list of products that are related to this fee. So this is alcohols, this is beer, this is beverages, mineral water, typical deposit-bearing products. But in Finland, the producer can either pay this €0.5 or join the deposit system. So it is not obligatory. It is not said that the system has to be implemented, and still there are a lot of provisions to regulate this complicated framework of the deposit. So in spite of the fact that producers do not have the obligation, they have choice, there are sets of provisions related to the deposit system framework to secure that if producers decide to join, if there is a system, it is a system that is well functioning. And I have prepared a link for you to this legislation. It is part of the Waste Act in Finland. Yeah, we are about to finalize. I would like to only say here that in different countries, the deposit provisions find their place in different acts. In Nordic countries, it is normally regulated in the Waste Act of Law. In Baltic countries, the regulations related to the deposit are part of the Act of Law on Packaging and Packaging Waste, which basically follows the provisions of the directive, European Directive on Packaging and Packaging Waste. One country decided to proceed with the separate Act of Law on Deposit Return Scheme, and that was Slovakia. So instead of looking into the other comprehensive acts, everything is collected in one piece of legislation, which is very practical, I must say. And here I would like to share with you some useful links to the text of provisions that are available in English. I will also maybe add some more links after this presentation, and my colleague Ainur will be able to provide that to you. I'm not sure for how long I have been talking, but I guess there is time for questions. So if you have any, I will be happy to answer.
Sevgili Anna, çok teşekkür ediyorum.
Thank you, Anna, so much. Dear Anna, it's been very fruitful, very nice as a presentation. So there are questions, yes. So I'm going to share them with you before we move on to Clarissa's presentation. So about your presentation, I have a couple of questions. So in terms of collection points, they are very, very important. And you mentioned that as well. And for example, we're quite concerned about collection points, actually. So for example, an example for you, think of a space of 500 square meters. There are 2 or 3 chain supermarkets in 500 square meters. And sometimes in a single building, you see 2 different supermarkets next to each other. So when you have several supermarkets next to each other, do you suggest a collective collection point for all three, or should they have separate collection responsibilities? So this is a question mark in our head. So that's what I'd like to ask you.
I would like to say that everything has to be practical, and in this case, as mentioned by you, it is possible, and it will be fully according to the legislation related to the return to retail and related to the fact that the collection point has to be located within, let's say, 150 meters, that the supermarket chains that you mentioned under the same building have common collection infrastructure. So it would be fully feasible to apply the regulation and at the same time have a practical solution in form of the one collection point.
Yani dış mekan toplama noktasını ortak.
In the exterior collection point, that's going to be outside, outdoors. So it's going to be a single place for 3 supermarkets. And then I can have a receipt, and that actually has to have a software that will be applicable in all 3 supermarket chains in order to coordinate the whole thing.
That's correct.
Anladım. Şimdi bir soru daha var.
All right, then there is another question. So in Turkey, we're thinking of PET, glass bottles, and metal cans. We're thinking of these 3 first, of course, for alcoholic beverages as well. So for 3 packages, for the ones that I've just mentioned, which ones have only these 3 ones? I know that a lot of European countries have all the packages involved, but just PET, glass, and metal can. So can you say to us an example, give an example of a European country that has only these 3 packages involved in a deposit system that can be quite similar to us?
I would say that majority of the deposit systems that are implemented in Europe have the 3 material types included, 7 out of 10. And Clarissa will show you a very detailed table on this. And maybe what I can add is that if, in terms of the product scope, yeah, because in Turkey the alcohol is supposed to be included, that is so far Finland, but also Romania and Scotland will cover the strong alcohol in the deposit scheme. So plastic, metal, glass is a majority of the countries, and as alcohol, we see the growing trend of including the alcohol products in the deposit scheme.
Şimdi katılımcılarımızdan bir soru geldi.
Now we have a question from one of the participants. In terms of RVM's capacity, is there any regulation about the capacity of RVMs and collection points?
Capacity, this is individual, and this is the decision of the retailer to adjust the proper automated collection infrastructure to the expected amount of received containers. So it doesn't need to be subject to the legislation. It has to, as I mentioned, it has to be a practical solution and reflecting the conditions that are representative for a single location. However, the major provision is related to the return to retail obligation, that the retailer has to be obliged to take back the beverage-bearing containers. But it would not be fair and it would not be practical for any reason to impose the obligation for example, automated collection point on certain retailers and manual on the other ones. It will be a decision of the collection of the single retailer.
Bir soru daha var. Cezai cezayı hangi kurum?
There is one more question. Which penalty is being issued by whom? This is something important. I mean, who is issuing the penalties? To whom? I mean, within these systems, when we speak about the public institutions or the who is issuing penalty to whom? So which bodies are issuing penalty to which bodies? Is it clear? Is it clear?
Yes, and yes, it is a complex issue, and of course, every fraud and every irregularity is reflected by the set of the penalties, and different institutions will be responsible for applying the fines, the penalties, depending on where and to what extent the fraud has taken place and who has committed that. And the main fee is related, the main penalty is related to the penalties for not attaining the targets, and that will be applied by the ministry or the ministry level authority.
Depozito sisteminde
In the deposit system, does the payment is being given according to the returned amount? Why you are using tonnage to issue the penalty? How you are calculating the penalty? I mean, according to what unit you are issuing the penalty? By looking at what?
No, the penalty should be calculated for not attaining the target, should be calculated per units, because deposit system registers the amount that's put to market. It is known exactly how many containers have been returned to the system. And if there is a difference between collection target for a certain year and the collected amount in a given year, then the penalty will be calculated based on the amount of the containers that have not reached the desired target. And you have seen, yes, on this slide that it was per ton, but this was the penalty calculated back from the number of the containers, because in the deposit system we will know exactly what container, based on the barcodes, as I mentioned, we know the amount of the put to market and of certain products. For example, we know exactly how many bottles of certain product, half a liter, blue or transparent, are part of the system, have been put on the market and sold to the consumers, and we will know, based on the collection data, exactly how many and strictly types of the containers have been collected in the system. So based on that, the penalty will be applied. And I will also mention here a very important issue of the manual collection, right? Because there will be some containers that are not subject to the automated collection. So they are not calculated per barcode at the collection point. However, they will always be counted at so-called handling center in the industrial machines. So even though the basic collection infrastructure will not provide this service, we will know exactly how many containers in the manual system have been returned. And in that way, there will be sufficient information to calculate the penalty.
Bir soru daha var.
There is one more question. We are making our program in Turkey, but when we consider the other European examples, you have got sorting and separation plants. What is the responsibility of sorting and separation plants? What are the examples? What are their responsibilities? What are their duties? We have got examples as TUT plants, I mean the sorting, separating plants. So what is the example? What example can you give from Europe?
What is the responsibility of the sorting plant? We can call them handling centers. In the standard European deposit system, we have a system operator. As we mentioned, he is responsible for management and for organizing the logistics and also for the handling centers. In these handling centers, you will see the packages that are collected in the collection points. If they have been collected in the automated collection infrastructure, they would be for the plastic and metal already compacted, and they would only need sorting by different, for example, colors. At this facility. As it comes to the glass containers, they will be counted at the handling center, and also all the packages that will come from the manual collection infrastructure will be counted through the industrial machines at such a facility. And the responsibility, maybe it's difficult to talk about responsibility from the perspective of the standard European deposit system, because the handling center is part of the deposit system operator. It is a facility that belongs to the system operator, and that is managed by the system operator as well. So normally there are no examples of the handling centers which would be a separate entity in a legal sense.
Başka soru görünmüyor şu
I don't
an.
see any other question right now.
Anna, çok teşekkür ediyorum.
Anna, thank you very much for all of the information you have provided for us.
Bir soru daha geldi.
There is one more question. I'm sorry. There is one more question I would like to address to you. In Europe, when we consider the countries which are applying deposit systems, are the glass bottles are refillable, reusable? How you are managing refillable, reusable bottles, glass bottles? What is the management strategy in Europe?
The management strategy is changing right now, because we see from the European Union a big push towards reuse. So we will see more and more reusable containers in the European markets, and this could be a result of the different policy instruments. And some policy instruments would be related to so-called quotas, where the producers or retail would be obliged to put to market or sell certain percentage of the products in refillable bottles. But they can also be related to the policy instrument, which is simply the establishment of the deposit framework for the refillable containers. And we have seen the example also in my presentation from Estonia and from Lithuania, where refillable containers are part of the centralized deposit system for this type of the container. So every producer in a Baltic country, for example, is obliged, if he has a refillable bottle, for example, beer, to be part of the central deposit system structure. In Lithuania, there are two organizations. One entity is responsible for the deposit bearing containers, single-use containers, and the second is responsible for the deposit bearing containers which are refillable. However, this is only the framework, the organizational framework of the deposit system for these containers. In all those countries, the collection infrastructure of both single-use and refillable bottles is exactly the same. And I can send you as a follow-up later on, or when maybe Clarissa finishes her presentation, the pictures of the collection infrastructure. I think actually in the presentation which I have shown, you could see the collection points from Estonia and Lithuania, and all of them except both single-use and the refillable container. So then how does everything happen behind the door? We mentioned that there are two organizations, and yes, they cooperate with each other. So in Lithuania and also in Estonia, the system operator for one way, he has a data for the collection, and he shares this data with the entity responsible for the refillable containers. And thus we know exactly how many containers that are refillable have been returned. And we know the collection rates. And then the entity responsible for refillable containers reports this data to the relevant authority. No, in this case, in Baltic countries, it is Ministry of Environment. What is maybe worth mentioning here that naturally, these two types of the packages have different logistics, because the one-way packages would normally go to the handling center for sorting or for recounting, whereas the refillable containers would be taken normally from the supermarket by the distributor of the producer directly to the producer's facility for washing.
Anna, bir şey daha var.
There is one more thing I would like to mention. When we consider the hotels, restaurants, and cafes, the citizens are going, especially to the restaurants. They are going to the restaurants, and water bottles, PET bottles, or the beverages bottles are coming, and they are going to apply the deposit system. After drinking this actually bottle, can the citizen take it away? This is my deposit material. I would like to take it with me, take away with me. Or the restaurant or the cafe should not allow them. Or can they also make a discount on the bill of the customer if they take the deposit away with themselves? What type of action is taken at the restaurants and cafes and for the single-use bottles or refillable bottles?
The basic rule is that if the deposit-bearing container stays in the restaurant and the restaurant staff only serves the beverage, so basically pours that in the glass, then the deposit is not part. I mean, it is calculated on the price, but it is not specified, because this consumer is not. Has not the intention to take the package out from the restaurant, right, and return it to the collection infrastructure. But of course, we would have some small restaurant and bars, and if the packages are taken away, then it might happen. Then the consumer will return that to the. This is for all on the go consumption. Of course, he will return it. However, the collection infrastructure, collection point can be also located at the restaurant and fast food points, depending on the framework decided by the legislation. For the small ones, the restaurants normally are treated as the collection location. However, they are only obliged to collect and store the containers that are have been subject to the consumption on place. So they have to collect those containers. But they are not obliged to collect the containers from the consumers coming from outside the restaurant, not being customers of this restaurant. And so as a consumer, you cannot get in the restaurant and require that the package purchased in the retail will be returned there. So only on-site consumption is subject to the collection obligation by the restaurant.
Ana, başka sorumuz yok bu arada.
As far as I can see, there are no other questions. If we receive any more questions, we can leave it later. Yes, after Clarissa's presentation, if you would like to show us more photographs, we would be very glad to see some examples, some example photos. But let's leave the floor to Clarissa, first of all.